Hi everyone, and welcome again to our sewing room. Today we're going to take you through a sew along for Pattern Emporium's all-in easy fit shirt. This shirt is a traditional style button up front, long sleeve with cuffs. I'm going to do the pleat option with the binding. You have two collar options with a collar stand, which is your traditional piece in the collar section, which helps the collar stand up a little bit more, or just the flat collar option. So today I'm going to take you through the collar stand option. So have a look at the fabric requirements, do your measurements, do up a little toil as always, and a toil can be, you just need to do the front section and the back section just to make sure it's going to fit across the bust, and then work out your sizing from that. Today I'm using a lightweight cotton to make my shirt. I'm just going to go through the pattern pieces and just make sure that we've got the right pieces interfaced and also that all the notches are marked. So really important when we're doing something with wovens, especially with so many elements like this shirt does have, make sure that all the notches are marked. Honestly, it will make putting it together when we get to those steps so much easier. Okay, so first of all, you should have an undercollar piece. So the undercollar piece is cut on the fold, and you have a center back notch on both the top section and the bottom section. This piece is not interfaced, so that's the undercollar. You then have an upper collar. Now the upper collar is interfaced on the wrong side, and again you've got that top notch in the center here and the bottom notch down there as well. So there are two main collar pieces. Now to accompany them, we're doing the collar stand. So we have two pieces of collar stand. Again, one is not interfaced and the other is interfaced on the wrong side. So with the collar stand, we should have notches about 1 inch from the curve. There should be one here and one down that end as well. So we have two notches on both sections of the collar stand. We then have, with our cuffs, we have two binding pieces. These are not interfaced. We then also have two cuff pieces. Now my cuffs have a seam in the middle because I bought 110 centimeter wide fabric and I had to pay a little bit of Tetris with it, and I needed 20 centimeters more. So just bear in mind when you're buying your fabric, the width of the fabric versus the fabric guide. Anyway, I have seams in my cuffs. So we have two cuff pieces and both are interfaced on the wrong side. We also have a back yoke piece. This is not interfaced. We then have the back yoke piece. Oh, sorry, I'll go back to the back yoke piece. It has notches in the center, and then we also have two notches towards the end, we then have our back piece, which is cut on the fold. Our back piece again has the same notches. We have one notch here, we have one in the center and one at the edge. We also have additional notches for the pleats. So where our center notch is, we should have two opposite that. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 notches on our back piece at that top straight section. So just make sure you've got all them cut out as well. We then have two front sections. These are not cut on the fold because it's a button-up shirt. We also have both of the inside pieces interface just down that front placket, so they're opposite to each other. We will have one front there and one front there with that interfacing piece down there. Now our front sections will have notches, so we have 3 notches just at the front here indicating where we're going to be putting our marks, and then we also have our sleeve notch as well on that. So just make sure that you've got your two front sections and they are interfaced. We then have our sleeve options. So we have two sleeves cut as mirror images. Again, we have notches on our sleeves indicating double notches for the back, center, and one single notch for the front. We'll also have additional notches at the bottom for our pleats. So in total, there should be 5 notches, and they're for our pleats and also our cuff. So just make sure that you have cut all of those notches out on all of your pieces and they're all interfaced. And let's get sewing. Now our first step is going to be to sew some guidelines on our front pieces, so where we've interfaced along here. So we're going to just be sewing 2 straight lines. So the first guideline that we're going to sew is 1 centimetre in from that raw edge. So I'm just taking a tape measure and I'm just going to mark that with a pin so that when I get over to my sewing machine, I know where that 1 centimetre guideline should be. And then the second guideline is going to be at 4 centimeters in. So while I'm marking, I'm going to also mark that 4 centimeter guideline as well. So I'm going to be sewing, again, this is just a straight line. You can use a basting stitch if you like. We can remove it later down the track. So we're going to sew a line that is straight from the edge of our fabric 1 centimeter in all the way down, and then the second guideline will be from the edge of our fabric 4 centimeters down. So if we go over to our machine on both sides of the front pieces and sew both of those guidelines. Now that we've sewn our guidelines, our next step is over at our ironing board. So where that first guideline is, the 1 centimeter guideline that we just sewed in from that raw edge, I want you to fold that inwards so that the interfacing is on top of each other. And we're just going to press along that guideline. And once you have done that, we will then fold again on that second guideline and press again. So basically we'll have 2 folds and you should see both guidelines, and you will end up with the inside of your garment looking like nice and neat like that, and on the outside you won't see any of the stitching, and that second row of stitching should be right on the edge of your second fold line. So if you go ahead and iron both sides of the front, our next step is to just find a flat surface to lie that edge that we just ironed facing upwards. I prefer to have the wrong side facing up because that's the side that we're going to sew along. And just pop some pins down to keep that nicely ironed edge nice and flat. Mine are a couple of inches apart, just making sure that it's all sitting nice and flat as we go to sew it. We're now going to go over to our sewing machine, and this is what we call a blind hemming foot. So most machines should have these in their kit. So just locate that one. So it's a standard foot and it has a little guideline along the bottom. So I'm just going to pop that foot on my machine. Now we want to set up our fabric in such a way that that guideline of the foot is on the edge of that fold. So that will run along the whole edge of the fold while we sew a nice even stitch along that way. So if your needle is over to the left hand side as mine is, I'll have to have my fabric facing this way. If you move your needle to the right hand side, you can turn your fabric around. And then we just want to sew a beautiful nice long straight stitch using that guide of that foot along the fold. So as I'm sewing, I'm just making sure that that folded edge runs on the inside of that blind hem foot, creating that beautiful even stitch all the way along. So once we've done that side, you can see that beautiful, nice, straight, even stitching on the inside. We can remove those 2 basting stitches that we did earlier. I find it easy to remove them now, so I'll go ahead and remove them on that side I've sewn down. And then I just want you to repeat those steps for the other front side piece as well. We're now working on our back piece where we're going to create our center back pleat. So you have an option that you can either have an inverted pleat, which is one that from the outside it will sit in like this, or you can have a box pleat that sits on the outside. The images in the tutorial will give you an indication of the different styles of pleats you can choose. I prefer my pleat to be inverted, so what that means for me is that I'm going to put my right sides together. So all we're going to do first is fold our back piece in half where that center back notch is, and we're going to locate that second lot of notches that we cut. So if you can see in here I have, that's our center back notch where it's folded, and then about 5 centimeters in you'll see a second lot of notches. So where that second lot of notches are, I'm going to just pop a pin so I know where I'm sewing, and what we're going to do is sew a stitch from that second notch. So that's the center fold, and we're going down this way about 5 centimeters. So we just want to sew a straight stitch all the way down about 5 centimeters. If you idea to mark that with your tape measure, just grab that so I know where I'm stopping at 120. So I'm just going to put a pin across there. So basically I'm sewing at that center knot, at that notch closest to that center fold, and down to 5 centimeters where that pin is. So now that we've sewn down on either your right sides or your wrong sides, depending on what type of pleat you like, open out your garment, and what you need to do now is grab where that pleat is and just open it out flat against the edges. So that's where we're sewing. We just basically want to pull that open and just spread that out evenly. So you'll find that will sit nice and evenly inside. Just pop some pins in there. Right, so what we've then done is created this beautiful pleat in the back of our garment. Now what we want to do is just baste across the top of that pleat where we've opened it out evenly. So you just need to baste from there to there just to keep that pleat in place when we attach the yoke. So we're still working on our back piece. Across here is my basting stitches. I have my right side facing up, that beautiful inverted pleat on the back section. I now want to grab my yoke piece. So what I want to do with the back yoke is right sides together with the back piece and just pop it so that those straight edges are matching. So you'll find that that neckline is pointing down towards the bottom of the garment. So we have our 2 straight edges matching across the top. You will have a center mark in your yoke piece. Match that up with that center seam. As we're pinning, we've got our notches on the edge here and on the edge here. So match those notches with the notches of the main bodice, back bodice part, and just pop pins evenly along there. We're then going to go over to our sewing machine and using a 1 centimeter seam allowance, do a straight stitch all the way along to join that yoke to that back section. After we've done that seam, we then want to take it to our overlocker and neaten that edge as well. If you don't have an overlocker, you can use a zigzag stitch on your machine to make sure that edge is nice and neat. So go ahead and do that, and then we'll come back. We have sewn both of those edges together and overlock them. We just want to take our unpicker and remove those basting stitches that held our pleat into place. So just flick those basting, just get rid of those basting stitches on both sides. Now an optional step here is to top stitch that seam down. So you can push that seam up towards the neckline and then top stitch that on the yoke piece if you prefer. So I still have my back piece with the right side facing up. I now want to join my front piece to the back piece. So what I'm going to do is take the corresponding front and join that at the shoulder seams. So what we're doing here is our front piece we're right sides together with our back piece, matching that curve of the arm so we know which piece goes where. And then we're just going to pin that along the shoulder seam. So just making sure that the neckline and the external shoulder piece is aligned, and then pin that on both sides. So we're just going to sew that edge along there, and we're going to do the same with the corresponding piece. And then we're going to do as we did for our back yoke, and we will neaten that seam on the overlocker. So you'll have both shoulder pieces attached wrong sides together to that back piece at the shoulders. So let's go ahead and sew them now. If you top stitched your back yoke piece along here, it does look nice if you do your shoulder seams as well. So press them towards the back and then top stitch on that yoke piece as well, just to create a nice even top stitching. Again, that's not something I'm doing today, so if you are, go ahead and do that step now. We're now going to prepare our collar with stand. So let's just check we have all our pieces. We want our upper collar, which is the interfaced section. We then have our under collar, which is slightly smaller and not interfaced. We then have our outside collar stand. So this is the interface section, and this sits on the outside when it's worn. And you then have our inner collar stand, and that's not interfaced. So you should have 4 pieces and all with the notches marked in on them. So what we want to do is we want to grab our inner collar stand. So this is our non-interfaced collar stand piece, and what we want to do is sew a guideline on the bottom straight edge. So as we're looking at our piece, I'm just going to hold it like that. You can see that we've got round edges on the top and a straight section at the bottom. So where we want to sew our guideline is along that straight section. So we want a 1 centimetre guideline all the way along that piece of the collar stand. So let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, so we've sewn our guideline along that inner collar stand. Now what we want to do is go over to our iron like we did with our front plackets and press that collar stand up along that guideline. So we'll end up with a folded bottom section of our inner collar stand. So we're now going to grab our 2 main collar sections. So we want our upper collar and our under collar with the right sides together. Now you'll notice that the collar has a long side and a short side. What we want to do is we want to sew up the sides, along the long side and down the other side. And so what we're going to do is just pin that together. The under collar will be slightly smaller, so you will notice that you will have a section of that protruding when you turn it over, and that's been deliberately made that way. So you want to pin that long edge of the collar all the way along and matching the sides as well. We're going to sew straight up and all the way along that long edge and then straight down the other side. Please ignore my cut corners. I'm just sewing along that straight edge at the moment. I'm just going to show you when I get to the corner how I do the pivot and turn. So we want to do this in one continuous sewing movement for our collar. So as we're coming up to that corner, I'm just going to slow that machine right down. And I want to stop 1 centimetre in from that edge. Okay, if you're not exact, you can hand turn that just so that you're one. Now with your needle down, you want to lift up your presser foot and turn your collar so you're now sewing down that straight edge. Okay, so you can see I left my needle down and I pivot and turn my collar, and now I just go down that side edge. Notice sewing along those edges in those corners where we pivoted. We want to take our scissors and just cut a triangular piece off. So that's that top corner. So we've gone straight, pivot across, and we just want to cut that corner off on both sides, and that will enable us to turn it nice and sharply for the collar. Now if you have one of these handy tools, these are great for turning the collars in. What I like to do is pop this with the straight edge along the side of my collar, and using that point, that creates that really nice turning of the collar as I'm pushing it out along the sides. And I'll just repeat that on both edges. So we're turning that collar to the right side and creating that nice point of the collar that you can see there. So now what we're going to do is head over to our iron, and what we want to do is that interfaced side of the upper collar, I want to iron that seam up towards the non-interfaced under collar. So we want to take our iron tip and just iron that seam up. Once we've done that, we can fold our collar over and iron it down nice and flat. So once you've ironed that nice and flat, you shouldn't see any parts of the under collar, which is the non-interfaced collar, on the right side. So your interface collar should be nice and neat with no parts of the bottom bit showing on the top. So if you can see, just go and re-iron that so that you can't see any of that under collar. Now what we're going to do is we're going to head back over to our sewing machine and we're going to do a basting stitch along that open edge. So where we've got our two collar pieces, I'm going to pin or clip, and we're just going to baste them closed. So I've changed back to my blind hem foot. That again, that's that foot with the guide in it. Now with the right side of my collar facing up, what I want to do is use that blind hem guide on the outside of my collar to top stitch. I'm just going to move my needle all the way over. And what I'm going to do is I'm in one continuous movement. I'm going to sew a top stitch all the way along my collar. I'm going to stop at the corner before I go over the edge of my fabric and then go along that top section as well. So let's go ahead and do that. I might just slow that right down, using that guide along the edge of your fabric, stopping at that corner, and again leave your needle down and pivot the collar. So I'm now going to go along that straight edge in one continuous movement. I'll just speed that up till I get to the other edge. Again, using that guide of the blind hem foot against the external part of the collar, it'll create a nice even top stitch. If you don't have this blind hem foot, you can use a hemming guide there as well. Slowing down as I get to the corner so that I can leave my needle down and pivot. Now, if you don't go close enough, you can use the hand wheel to just do those extra couple of stitches. Now, I have got a little bit of bulk in there, so I'm just going to pop my hump jumper in so that the machine won't get stuck on that little bit of bulkiness. And there we have our nice top stitched collar. Okay, with our collar, I now want to put the non-interface, so that's the under collar section, facing up. I then want to get the interface section of our collar stand and locate that edge notch on that curve bit there. So that should be about 1 inch in from that curve. I want to match that notch with the edge of my collar. So you'll find that the collar stand will sit out from your collar as you're pinning that in there. So just pin that to match that edge notch with the edge of your collar, and then repeat that on the other edge as well. I then want to pin that in between all the, and I'll show you. So what you will have pinned is the collar stand with the round sections facing towards that raw edge of the collar, and I'm just going to go ahead and baste that along there to attach them together. Before I've now basted that together, so now what I want to do is I want to flip the collar back over so that the collar stand is lying flat on my work surface. So I've now got my collar facing up. So the non-interface collar stand, and just pop that on top like that. So let's set that all up and then we will pin that down. So as we're pinning that, I'm going to match those two notches of that non-interface section first, just so that I make sure that that is accurate. Where that fold line is folded up, I want to leave that folded, so I'm going to pop a pin in there as well. So you will be sewing over that edge folded up, so that's what that should look like. So let's do that on the other side as well, matching up those notches first and then pinning that folded edge down so that it remains folded as we're sewing around that collar stand. Now, when we do our collar stand, it's really important to get that round. Now I'm just going to pin that, I'm just going to pin that all the way along to attach that collar stand piece in. I would then suggest, after you've pinned this, to grab a marking pen, a fabric marking pen, and we're just going to mark that round section of those corner bits of the collar. Because they will be on display when you're wearing the shirt, it's really important to get them nice and even and round. So I do like to mark them with my fabric marker. So all I'm doing here is I'm just going to follow that curve of that round bit of the collar with my fabric marker about 1 centimetre in, so that I've got a guideline to sew as such. So you can see there in the pink, I've done that round guideline. I'm just going to do that on the other side as well. Trying to get them as even to the pattern piece as possible. So I've now got my 2 guidelines in there. Now what we want to do is sew around that whole section that we've pinned. So what we're going to do is we're going to start 1 centimetre in on that interface collar stand, and we're going to sew all the way around that curve, all those pieces here that we've pinned, and then all the way around that curve there as well to the other end. So push that collar stand all the way out, and then what we're going to do is head over to our ironing board and make sure that that is both sides and that seam in the middle is sitting nice and flat. So let's go and iron that collar stand down, and then we'll come back. At this stage here, I'm also going to remove that basting stitch of the collar, so you can actually see that above the collar stand. So just go ahead and remove that basting stitch now before we do any. We're now going to attach our collar stand to our garment. So what we're going to attach is that interface side. I've just gone and marked my notches. So I have 1 notch there and a 2nd notch there. Those 2 notches are going to align with our shoulder seams on our garment, and the edges of our collar stand are going to line up with the front placket. So let's grab our main bodice, and I'm going to put that front side with the right sides facing up. I'm now going to grab my collar, and I have got that interface section with the notches marked. So I'm just going to do that first notch there, which is sort of, I guess, quarter of the way in, and I'm going to match that to the shoulder stand. So that's my front placket here, and coming along is the shoulder seam. So what I want to do is make sure that shoulder seam is facing towards the back of my garment, and I'm just going to pin that collar stand to that seam there. Okay, I'm now going to do that front part of my collar seam. Now you'll see the collar stand actually is folding in a little bit on that interfaced edge. So I want to make sure that that remains folded, that little bit there, as I attach that to the edge of the placket. So that edge should stay folded, and I'll show you in a minute. I'll just pin that. So you want to make sure that that unfolded edge of the collar stand is free. So I've matched up the side of my placket of the front to that little folded edge of the collar stand there. And then that second mark is the notch of the shoulder seam. I'm then going to continue around and match that second mark there, the notch, to the other shoulder seam, again pressing those shoulder seams towards the back edge of the garment and making sure that that folded edge of the collar stand remains free. I don't want to attach that to the garment. Again, going around to the front placket, the edge of my collar stand with that little piece folded inwards matches the fold of the placket. So I have 2 folds, that align neatly there. It's really important to make sure that you match them up correctly for this step, because you will see that when the garment's worn. So I've now got 4 pins in my collar stand where it's attached to the garment. So I'm just going to go ahead and pin in between each pin, and then we'll sew that together. Okay, so I've got this all pinned together. I'm just making reference again to these corner edges, making sure that both folded edges of the placket and the collar stand are neatly aligned, because that will show on the garment. I then want to go ahead and stitch all the way across this collar stand, attaching it to the garment, again making sure at that other edge that both sides are aligned. So that's a 1 centimetre seam allowance. Keep that fold edge out of the way as we sew it, and just go carefully. Before we proceed to sew down that other part of the collar stand, we're now going to iron up that seam that we just sewed. So what I want to do is iron up where we attached the collar stand to our garment. I want to iron that seam up towards the collar stand so that when we flip it over, it's going to be nice and neat. So if you tuck those edges in that we just sewed, you should have this nice neat edge that's just folding. We're still on the inside of our garment, so I'll just show you. Once we tuck all those pieces into that collar stand, we'll have this really nice finish on the inside. So what you want to do is go ahead and pin all of that down. So I'm just going to lie that flat, and that collar stand the folded edge of that will cover that seam that we've just sewn. And then if you just pin that all the way down around that collar seam we just sewed, you sometimes will need to just pull that down over that seam. I use lots of pins here to keep this nice and straight. Those curved bits, just making sure those shoulder seams are pushed towards that back. Now we're just going to tuck that. Again, I've got lots of pins, pinning that collar stand towards the inside of the garment, tucking in those ends where we attached it, they're up in there. I've got pins there holding that all in nice and neat. What we're going to now do is go over to our sewing machine and put our blind hem foot on again. And I like to, if you sew this from the inside facing out, it just helps create a nice even finish. I like to start in the centre back because the collar will fold over that on the outside and you won't see it. If you start down here, this is on the front placket, you tend to wear your shirt open, so you will actually see where you've started and finished. So I tend to start in the centre back. What we're going to do is put our blind foot on, and we're going to sew all the way along that whole collar stand. And again, we will end up back at that centre back bit. So once you finish top stitching, your collar stand should look lovely and finished like that. And then from the other side, again, it should sit nice and flat. So just make sure you're happy with that. Okay, so now we have our beautiful collar done. Congratulations if that was your first collar stand. Don't forget, most of the collar stand is worn on the inside of your neck. So if you are a little bit concerned that it doesn't look perfect, don't be too worried, because you will wear that on the inside and on the outside. Again, that beautiful collar will fold over to hide most of it. Okay, so your garment should still be open at the side seams. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to do our hems. Because there's such a sharp curve in the sides, it's easier to do the hems now while they're all in single pieces. So what you need to do is go and overlock all these raw edges of your hems, or finish them all with a zigzag stitch. So let's go and do that, and then we will move. We've now got our overlocked hems on all of our pieces. So what we need to do is go over to our iron and we're going to fold that up 6mm and iron that all flat all the way along each piece. And then after we've ironed that first bit flat, we're then going to turn it over and iron it again. So you will enclose that overlocking or zigzagging within a double folded hem. So now that we've ironed all of our hems in that double fold, what we're going to do is put our blind hemming foot back on our sewing machine, and we're just going to sew that folded edge all the way up on each individual piece. Just make sure that when you're doing the plackets at the front section here, don't worry about the little tails, we can cut them off at the end, but just make sure that your edges are aligned nice and neatly before you start sewing them, because that will show on the garment. So just making sure that you've ironed it so that when you start to sew it, that's what you'll see. You won't see a bit hanging out like that. You just want to make sure that front section is nice and flat. We're now going to sew our side seams together. So just make sure that we're matching them wrong sides together and starting from under the arms. I'm just going to match up both side seams and just making sure that you align them evenly at those hems that we just sewed. So just pin them so that they match evenly on both edges there together. So we're going to do that for both side seams, matching those side notches as well, and that waist notch, just to make sure that they're nice and even. We're then going to sew that together using a 1 centimetre seam allowance, and then we're going to neaten that edge on our overlocker. So that's on both side seams from under the armpit to that hem. We're just going to sew that straight along and then neaten it either using a zigzag stitch or our overlocker. So if you go ahead and pin and sew your side seams, and then we'll move on. Okay, just before we move on to the sleeves, where our front side seam meets our back side seam, if we just push that seam towards the back of the garment, and then we're just going to sew a 1 centimetre stitching line down there just to anchor that hem and that side seam towards the back of the garments. Okay, we're now going to work on our sleeve pieces. So locate one of your sleeves and the back part of the sleeve with the double notches. If you go down to the bottom where you've marked, you'll see that the notch closest to the edge here is our sleeve cuff opening. Use your pattern piece to determine the length of that sleeve opening. Now what I've done is just drawn a line with my fabric pen from that notch to where the sleeve opening finishes. What I want to do is actually go over to my sewing machine, and I want to sew very close to this line. So using about a 6mm seam allowance, I want to sew up one side and then down the other side. Now, no, it's not cut. I just want to use that line as my guide. Now, when I get to the end here, I don't want to do a sharp pivot point because that will create a pleat in my opening. So I'm almost wanting to sew a little bit around it. So using a curve at the end to create a nice opening. So if you go ahead and just sew that nice sort of round curve point on either side of that line, then we'll cut that open. Okay, so I've sewn a curve line around that opening. Now what I want to do is just take my scissors and I just want to cut along that line that I drew to open that sleeve cuff opening. So don't cut through that curve at the end, just cut up to it as close as you can. So do that on both sides of the sleeve. So to create our binding pieces, we're going to take them with the wrong sides together and just fold them in half and grab our iron and very carefully just iron that flat. So that's just simply in half. I'm now going to open that back up, and where that center line is that I've just created, that center fold mark, I'm just going to fold each sides towards that fold line. So I've now created, both sides are folded towards that fold line, and I'm going to iron them down. So it's nice and even. Both raw edges are meeting in the middle at that fold line that we've just created in the previous step. Okay, so I've now got both raw edges meeting in the middle. I'm going to open that back out. Now what I want to do is just fold that in half again, so that those two raw edges are enclosed. So what I'm seeing now is a folded edge here and two folded edges on that side. And then I'm just going to simply iron that together, and that's created my cuff binding. So I have this narrow piece of binding that I'm going to use to create my cuffs. So do the same thing with the other. In the tutorial, you'll notice there are two methods for attaching the binding. There's an easy method and there's the traditional method. Today we're going to use the easy method, of course. So what we want to do is grab our sleeve where we've just created that opening, and where with that cut edge of our opening, we're just going to have that sit inside our binding. So that's going to butt up against that folded edge of our binding that we just created. So leaving a little bit of excess binding, just start at the bottom. You can leave about 1 inch, and you just want to wrap that binding around that raw edge of the sleeve cuff opening that we created. So I'm just going to pin that there. So basically we're having that cut edge butt into the binding, and that's wrapping both sides of the fabric. Now when we get up to that center bit, we enclose that in the binding as well, and that we will sew that down later. So you just want to make sure that all parts of that sleeve opening are in that binding area. So I'm just going to pin that, and then we're going to go and sew that down. So we'll be basically sewing it in a straight line, and you'll notice that the binding has got extra binding at both ends, just so that it goes on nice and neatly. We'll trim them at the end. So just making sure that that raw cut edge of the sleeve cuff opening is enclosed in that binding. So what you'll have is the binding sitting like so. So now what we need to do is go and sew down on the edge of that binding where it folds over. It's a bit hard to tell on my stripes, but where the edge of the binding is, that's the bit we want to sew down. So if you have a 1/4 inch seam foot, now would be the time to use it, because you'll get right on that edge. Okay, we're now going to take our sleeve and fold it with the wrong sides together so that both pieces of the binding are lying on top of each other. So you'll have this curved edge at the top and match them at the bottom. So I want to make sure that the sleeve is matched at the bottom, and I'm just going to put a pin in across the bottom, and then it's curved at the top. So I'll show you what that looks like. I'm just going to put my pins in there. So you're basically folding it so that the binding is sitting out from the sleeve. So that's the piece of the binding there, and then you've got these two tail pits at the end. Now what I want to do is turn my binding around, and I want to go over to my machine, and where this meets the sleeve at this top bit here, I want to start here and sew in a diagonal line straight down. So I'm going at a 45-degree angle. So where my pin's sitting, that's where I want to sew. So I'm going to go down. I'll mark it with my fabric marker, if that makes it easier to see. So we're basically going down on an angle, starting from this top corner here and ending up on the outside of the binding there. So we want to do that on both sides. Okay, now that we've done that step, we want to pop our sleeve with the wrong side facing up. Now you'll have a narrow side, I'm going to refer to the narrow side and the wide side of the sleeve. So what we want to do now is we want to make sure that the seam binding that we just did on the wide side is facing inwards. So by that, I want to just pin that to the inside. So on the wide side of our sleeve, our binding will sit on the inside. So just pin that down. So that will look like that. All right, so let's put our sleeve right side up and form our pleats. We'll have 4 notches. Let's call them starting from the binding, with where the binding is pinned underneath. We'll have 1 there, then we have notch 2, notch 3, and notch 4. Okay, so let's pick up notch 2. Okay, so not the one closest to the binding, but the second one in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a fold line along notch 2. Okay, so just with my fingers. Then where that fold line is, I'm going to match that to notch 1. I'm going to go over and match it to notch 1. So I have now created a pleat. So let me show you that again. We've got notch 1, notch 2, notch 3, and notch 4. Notch 2, I'm going to put a fold line along notch 2. Then where that fold line is, I'm going to flip that over. That's my fold line here. I'm going to flip that over and match it to notch 1, creating a pleat. I'm just going to pop a pin in that little pleat now. So I've now got my binding, I've now got a pleat, and I've still got notch 3 and notch 4. Okay, so now what I want to do is where notch 4 is, the last notch here, again I want to pinch that to create a fold, and then I want to drag that fold over to notch 3. So that fold line that I just created will butt up against notch 3, and I'm just going to pin that in place. Okay, so what I've now got on my sleeve is 2 pleats and my binding tacked in underneath. And then I'm just going to go and baste that across there. But let's do that on the other sleeve because it will be a little bit different. Okay, so again, I'm going to put my right side facing up. The wide side of my sleeve is the one I'm working on, the one with all the notches. I'm going to fold that binding underneath, and I'm going to pin that in place. That's our first step. Okay, so now I've got our notches. I'll just make that binding sit nicely so I can do my notch, so I can do my pleats. And I've got, so starting from the binding edge again, I've got notch 1, notch 2, notch 3, and notch 4. Okay, so let's go to notch 2. So we've got our binding here, notch 1, notch 2. Pick up notch 2 and put a fold along notch 2. Just with your fingers, create a temporary fold. Push that fold to match up with notch 1 and then pin it down. Creating our first pleat. Right, now we've got notch 3 and notch 4. At notch 4, I want to create a fold with my fingers on notch 4. Bring notch 4 to match that fold line to notch 3, creating that second pleat, and pin that into place. So again, on the opposite sleeve, I should have 3 pins. I've got my binding folded under and my 2 pleats facing towards the binding. So I just need to go ahead and baste that across there as well. So you'll have the 2 sleeve edges with the pleats to go and baste. We're now going to the other end of the sleeve now. So we've got our pleats and our binding at one end, and we've got the head of our sleeve up here. So you would have marked a double notch for the back and a single notch for the front. So in between those two notches, I want you to just sew one row of long basting stitch. Sew it just outside of the seam allowance because we may not require it, but and we will remove it later. So it's like a gathering stitch, and we just need a single row on both sleeve heads. So if you go and sew that between the two notches and then come back. Next steps, we're preparing our cuffs. So what you need to do is sew the interfacing to the wrong sides of the cuffs, and then what we're going to do is on each cuff, and just on one side, we're going to sew one of those guidelines, and we're going to go 1 centimetre in from the raw edge of the cuff and just sew that all the way along. That can be a basting stitch. Again, with the other cuff, do the same thing. The cuffs are even, so it doesn't matter which edge you use, as long as you use one long edge on each cuff. We're going to go and iron the cuffs now with the wrong sides together in half. Firstly, so if you go ahead and iron them like that, and then once you've done that, along that guideline that we've just sewn, we're going to turn that with the wrong sides together and iron that as well. So if we do that for both cuffs, and then we'll move on. We're now going to attach the cuff to the sleeve. So what we want to do is that edge of the cuff that's not folded, we're going to attach that to the sleeve opening where we made the pleats earlier. So we want to have the wrong side of the sleeve facing out. So you should see the wrong side of your fabric and the right side of your cuff is going to go together. I know, complete opposite of what we normally do. So what we're going to do is match the edge of the cuff. We should have 3/8 of an inch where we've marked that, and we're going to have that sitting out from the sleeve edge. So where that 3/8 of an inch notch is, that's where we're going to have attach that to that binding that we have got sitting outwards. And then we're just going to go and pin that cuff all the way around, and we should have the equal number of cuff overhanging at the other edge. So if you just go ahead and pin that to our sleeve edge, we can actually cut those binding tails flush now. We don't need to have them extending out, so I'll just cut them off, and then I'm just going to attach my cuff all the way around my sleeve edge. So as you pin that all the way around, we're then going to go over to our sewing machine, and we are going to attach that using a 1 centimetre sleeve allowance. So if we do that on both sides of our sleeve cuffs, and then we can proceed. Now our sleeve should look like this. We have got a cuff section joined to the wrong side of the sleeve, like that. Now what we want to do is we want to fold the cuff back. So where we made that crease earlier, we want to fold along that crease with our right sides together. And we want to make sure that that bottom part of the seam of the cuff that we just made is sitting flat. And then as we fold on that fold line, our beautiful seam that we fold that we ironed up before should sit neatly above that binding. So you can see there that we have the bottom part of the cuff here. We have that folded edge of the cuff aligning neatly with that binding, and that seam that we just made is pressing downwards away from the cuff. So what we want to do now is we want to align this section here, and we want to sew a straight line down the cuff edge. So we want to do the same thing on the other side of the cuff. where we're folding the right sides together with that fold line. That matches the top of that seam that we just created, and having that other seam pointing down, and we're just going to sew up along that edge. So we have two edges that we're going to sew. We're going to sew all the way along so that that seam that we sew from the top to the bottom of the cuff, including that extra piece of cuff there, will align with that piece of binding. So we want to make sure that everything is going to sit nice and straight, aligning with that piece of binding on that side, and we want to do the same thing on this side. So we've now sewn along those edges of the cuff, so matching in with the binding. We now want to turn that cuff to the right side. So I'm just going to use my turner again and press that cuff out nice and straight along those edges, and turning that cuff to the right side on both ends. And the cuff to the right side, which is what we've done. We want to push those ends in underneath where we've turned. So you should find that as we've turned that cuff, those ends should just sit nicely in like that. So if you just go ahead and pin this side of the cuff down, that folded line there that we made the guideline should cover our seam that we made earlier. So just make sure that as you're pinning, your fold line of the cuff on the right side of your fabric is covering that seam line that we made earlier. And then if you find this easier to do from the right side, by all means, with these corners, so you can see here I have all these messy corners. They are just going to be pushed upwards towards the cuff, and then that cuff should fold beautifully just over to hide all of those edges. So you can see there that none of those edges are now showing. And again, that seam that we create will sit underneath that fold line and nice and flat. I'll just pop that to the inside so you can see what that beautiful cuff is now going to look like from the inside, the right side. So as we have now pinned all of that, excuse me, we now have our cuff all pinned to the right side, and that's all sitting and hiding all of those seams and our beautiful pleats and our binding. This around in a square. So it's up to you where you start from with the cuff. I like to sort of start roughly on the opposite side of the pleat, because that's the side that will go under your wrist. So I tend to start about here, and what we want to do is we want to use our blind hem foot, and we want to sew all the way around this whole rectangle of the cuff. Okay, I'm going to show you how to sew the cuff using the blind hem foot. So what I've done is I'm starting about 1 inch in from the edge. I've got my needle dropped right down, removed my first pin. I'm just using that guide of the blind hem foot on the edge of the cuff as I'm sewing. Just guiding that with my fingers. Making sure that I've got no puckers underneath my cuff. Now I've got my pin facing the wrong way, which isn't going to be overly helpful, so I'm just going to change that around here. That's just pinning in all my seams that the cuff will hide. As I come up to this corner to pivot, just keep everything nice and straight. I'm leaving my pin in for now, and I'm just going to stop as close to the edge as not to come off it with my fabric. I'm going to pivot and turn my sleeve around. I have a lot of bulk in under that corner there that's hiding all those seams, so I'm going to just pop my hump jumper in so that it doesn't get stuck there. And again, that will just enable it to sit nice and flat and sew it without struggling. So I'm just going to stop at this corner again and leave my needle down and pivot my fabric around, and then I'm just going to sew along this straight edge. I shouldn't have go a little bit faster along this straight edge. Again, just keeping everything nice and flat and even so I don't get any puckers in my cuff. And coming up to this corner again, I'm just going to slow right down so I don't go over the edge. Get ready to stop. If I stop too early, I'll use my hand wheel to just turn a little bit, and then I'll just come down. Now I'm just going to stop there and straighten that sleeve back out. I've got a lot of fabric in under this corner here again, so I'm just going to go up until I get to the end. Okay, I'm going to turn that around because I remember I started an inch in, and again I'm just going to use my hump jumper to so that I don't my foot doesn't get stuck. And then I'm just going to back stitch where I started, and I like to now just take my cuffs and just pin them closed, admiring my nice even stitching, and just having a look how that all sits lovely and flat now. Okay, now we're going to add our sleeves into our bodice section. So what we need to do is take our bodice and turn it so that it's inside out. And then we grab our sleeve part and make sure that we're using the right sleeve in the right section of our bodice. So at the moment I've got the back piece of the bodice facing towards me. So what I want to do is hold my sleeve with the underarm seam in one hand and have a look for those double notches here on the right side. Now I can see that I have the right piece in my hand. What I want to now do is grab this sleeve and just feed it into that opening. So just feed it through that opening, and I've still got my underarm seam of the sleeve in my hand, and I just want to match that to the side seam of the bodice. So I've got the two sleeves, I've still got the outside of the bodice on top, and the sleeve has now been fed down into the bodice. Okay, so I'm just going to work around this armhole edge here. What I'm going to do is just doubly check I'm using the right piece. So I've got double notches here to double notches here. So before you start sewing, that's one thing I do recommend checking. The next thing I'm going to match is the sleeve head. We have a single notch indicating the center of the sleeve. Now that is going to align with the notch in the yoke. So you will see about an inch in from that shoulder seam, there's a notch on that yoke piece. So that is where the center of the sleeve will align. Make sure you're not aligning that to the shoulder seam. It goes against that yoke seam, that yoke notch, sorry. Okay, so now what we do, I've got two pins, one at either end of my sleeve. At the bottom of the sleeve where the curve is, this will fit nicely. So pin up around from the bottom of the sleeve up to the notch, the first notch that you've made of the back of the sleeve, where you started that gathering stitch. So just pin that part of the sleeve all in without doing anything, any gathering. because that should just match up perfectly. And do the same thing with the front section. So basically we're pinning the whole sleeve, the bottom of the sleeve, up to where we started that gathering stitch, and you should find that they will match in beautifully. Just shake your shirt out a bit as you need to go around that corner bit. And you'll find there that's fitting nicely. Now, sometimes doing an inset sleeve, we have to allow for that top curve. That's why we did that gathering stitch. You may or may not need it. So have a look between the front section of your sleeve and where we put that first pin, and just see if you can fit that in evenly. If you've got a little bit of excess fabric, what you can do is very, very gently pull on that gathering stitch. We don't want to create a gather as such. We just want to bring that sleeve in ever so slightly. Now that's probably too much because I'm going to create a gather there. So I sort of want something along the lines of that. If you can see, I have not gathered it because I don't want to create puckers. I've just simply created a slight wave in the fabric. Now, because that gathering stitch is outside the seam allowance, we should be able to pin that and it will fit nicely in that part of the sleeve. And as we sew it, we're going to be very careful not to create any puckers in the fabric. And then we want to do the same thing with the back sleeve. So you might find that your sleeve will fit nicely. More than likely you will need to just give it a little, give that gathering stitch a tiny little pull, not to create a gather. We're certainly not creating puffy sleeves in this garment. So if you've gathered it too much, just stretch it back out again and then just pin that to the garment. Okay, now we're going to go over to our machine and we're going to sew all the way around with that sleeve head. So you can see how I've got a little bit of waviness in the actual sleeve from where I pulled those gathers. So let's go over and sew that. Okay, now to sew the sleeve in, I find it easy to remove that front section of my machine, and I have got my sleeve all the way around just the neck of the machine. So I always start at the underarm and pop my foot down first and pop my needle down, and doing a 1 centimetre seam allowance with just a little bit of speed. Probably not that much. Now, as we're sewing around on a curve, you're going to find that you're going to need to keep feeling this garment so that you don't get any puckers in. I'm sewing with the bodice facing up. So I just find going really slow as I'm moving the garment around, just feeling for any lumps, anything that's unusual. As we're sewing, we're just going quite slow. We're moving our garment regularly because there is a lot of fabric, and we just want to make sure that all our seams and joins are facing the right way and we haven't got any puckers in our sleeve. The best way to tell is using your fingers with feeling. Going nice and slow. If you're feeling any puckers at any time, just stop, rearrange with your needle down because you don't want to lose your spot. The sleeve will need quite a bit of rearranging because you are sewing a curve. At this point, we're now going to check our sleeve and make sure that we haven't got any puckers anywhere, because if we do, now is the chance to unpick it. So I'm super happy with how this has gone in. You can see there, that's my basting stitch, but you can see how nicely that sleeve has gone in with no puckers. That little bit of gathering has just helped it sit nicely. around the sleeve head so you can see how beautiful that's sitting. And I can just remove that basting stitch while I'm here. And then we just go and do the same thing with the other sleeve. And then what we're going to do after we've done that is just go around and overlock this inside seam on our overlocker. So what I like to do first is to grab the two bottom sections of my shirt and pin them together. Then I know that I'm actually making my shirt even from the get-go. Okay, so now I've got that pinned nice and even on the hem. The next step is to work out where the biggest point, the apex of your bust is. Now on ladies' garments, traditionally the buttonholes are on the right hand side and the buttons are on the left hand side. So you want to have it folded over like that. So what I like to then do is fold this over so that the placket is matching the outside of the other placket line. And what I'm looking to do here is to just mark with a pin where the apex of my breasts are. Okay, so that's going to be where my first button starts, is on the widest part of my chest. Okay, so I know that I have pinned that properly because I had the bottom pinned as well. So now I can take my shirt off knowing that that's where my first button is going to, is going to be here, and I'll put all my buttonholes corresponding from that start point. You will find that there is a buttonhole guide. So what you need to do is lie your garment flat out on the table, and starting from that first pin that we made is grab the buttonhole guide piece and just lay that on top and put a pin in where you're going to be putting all of your buttons. And so here's the shirt I finished yesterday, same fabric, just in a soft grey undertone. So I again have gone through and added in all of the buttonholes. I did do a button up on the collar stand as well. I like that finish. I'll never wear it buttoned up like that, but I do like the way that it just sort of makes that collar stand sit. Again, I've just used quite small buttons and done all my buttonholes. I've also done the same with the buttonhole on the sleeve cuff. So if you go ahead and mark all of the buttonholes on your shirt and then go and sew all your buttons on, and then it's just a matter of pressing your beautiful shirt.